Hello, Bucharest. This is Thomas Hylland Eriksen speaking to you. And it's, first of all, I have to say that it's a great honor and pleasure for me to be allowed to address this Romanian public anthropology meeting. Obviously, I would have loved to come to Bucharest and take part physically, but doing it virtually is the next best thing. And I'm really grateful to Maria Radan Papasima and the other organizers for inviting me to say a few words at the conference. Now, it may seem as if I'm in the field, well, nearly. It may nearly seem as if I'm in the field. Technology is not perfect, okay? This is a better version. So when I go like this, suddenly what happened to my wrist, it disappears and so on. The background does look a bit like one of my field sites. In fact, it could have been Grand Bay in the north of Mauritius, but it could have been any place in the tropics, in a tropical island, because these places have become so generic and so similar to one another. You can see that this is a better version, and you've already guessed that I'm not in Grand Bay, I'm not in the field. I'm at home in Oslo, and that's how it is. And this just as a reminder that although technology can help us, it really is entirely perfect. So, here I am, at home in Oslo. Now, the annual Why the World Needs Anthropology event, anthropologists event, is always a major thing in the EASA context. Now, with its own satellite event in Romania, which is a very exciting thing. And the title of the second part of this conference is a creative twist, namely Why Technology Needs Anthropologists, Shaping a Sustainable and Human-Centered World. Which is, a question, the importance of which is impossible to deny. The importance of, because we really need anthropologists. We don't just need technologists. And we know that not everybody does, but we have to tell them, and we have to find the right ways of telling them. So the organizers ask us how we can use tech to contribute to making a more human-centered world, and God knows we can need that. And we have a big job to do in this domain. The dominant technology world is dazzling in the sophistication, from robotics to chatbots, and it's developed incredibly fast. Some would say frighteningly fast, just in the last few years. I mean, as you all know, a year ago, in September 2022, nobody outside the inner recesses of OpenAI and some secret societies, perhaps in Silicon Valley, had heard of ChatGPT. And by now, I think most of you have at least tried it. And the outlandish idea, I call it outlandish, okay, that AI may in time develop human consciousness is now widespread and is being discussed seriously by philosophers, technology developers, and many others. Anthropologists know better. We know that AI will never be us, but we should be aware of the possibility that we may become more like AI, because there are certain ways of communicating which are contagious. So the organizers of this event ask, how can new technologies be used to reduce inequalities, communicate cross-culturally, and promote values of inclusion, diversity and tolerance? I don't think they can, but people can. Sometimes by using technologies, ranging from smartphones to robots, and our job as anthropologists and people who think like anthropologists, you don't have to be a card-carrying anthropologist to do this job, although it helps. So our job may be to show why and how people are necessarily qualitatively different from the gadgets, which are sometimes programmed to pretend that they are persons. To be blunt, we are different because we have bodies, we are aware of our mortality, we are irrational and emotional, and we ask questions about life and death, morality, and we worry about the future, the past, our relationships, and try our best to care about other creatures. This contrast is a recurrent theme in science fiction, which has recently and increasingly become part of our lives. And one often comes to think that the developers and the promoters of new technologies, luckily with some exceptions, have read the wrong kind of science fiction when growing up. They've been reading Arthur C. Clarke instead of Ursula Le Guin, Isaac Asimov, rather than Margaret Atwood. Now, for the record, I read those guys as well, okay? But I moved on. Okay, so there is something about our mission as a profession which has always had a tinge of something countercultural. Think about the way Boas demolished scientific, as it were, racist pseudoscience in the early 20th century. And he had a major impact. Malinowski gave public lectures on the assumed irrationality of the so-called savages, showing that their minds functioned in exactly the same way as ours under different circumstances, drawing on his extensive knowledge of Trobriand economics. Or, moving on a decade or so, Margaret Mead, whose critique of American child raising practices in the 1930s had a real social impact. She had influence outside academia, much more than within academia. And most recently, just a couple of years ago, the late David Graeber and David Wengrow's provocative book, The Dawn of Everything, shows that the human past was vastly more complex than the received wisdom has told us. All of this is countercultural, it goes against the grain, and it tells us that things are not quite what they seem. Not necessarily more complicated, maybe a bit more complex, but different. So anthropology has always anthropologists has always represented a non-hegemonic view of the world, frequently in opposition to common sense, as it is called, which is frequently not particularly common nor very sensible. And the insistence on holism, the insistence on context and relationship helps us to understand and to come to terms with the world. I mean, let's just think about the difference between economics as an academic discipline and economic anthropology. In economic science, which is very respectable and which has given us a lot, but which has its limitations, okay? The individual is always at the center. For a long time it was the rational actor. Increasingly it has become, well, the actor with limited rationality, but still it's individual and the individual choice, individual decisions that are at the center and at the beginning of the analysis. Whereas in economic anthropology, where do we start? We start with a gift. We start with Levi-Strauss's kinship atom, affinality, trust, alliances with people you're not related to, and obviously with his predecessor Marcel Mauss and his teachings about reciprocity as a fundamental aspect of human existence, as a total social phenomenon, as Mauss calls it. So, and also, I mean, it needs to be taken into account that unlike most other academics, we shape and develop and tweak and change and publish our theoretical insights by collaborating with the people we work with, not being content to discuss just with other intellectuals. This implies, and it entails, a slightly sort of, I think, anarchist attitude, doesn't it? There is a bit of anarchism in anthropology, I believe, because it implies an irreverent attitude to the received wisdom and the awareness that one size does not fit all. What might work for Nepalese villages does not necessarily make sense for people in the Andes or in a South African township. Universal solutions, one-size-fits-all solutions, typical of the developmentality logic, which also has its merits, by all means, but it needs anthropology in order to be sufficiently nuanced and perhaps useful and meaningful. So these universal solutions are usually flattening and reductionist, whether we apply them to food production, to education, or to politics. You have to start with the local. We have to start with the resources that people have. Nobody likes to be told what to be done. Well, maybe they do, but only after you've shown that you respect and you're aware of the skills and knowledge they already have. This is trivial, but it's a kind of insight which is very often forgotten or neglected. From development people to people trying to integrate migrants to Western European societies like my own. And finally, now I've spoken a bit about digitalization, about what differentiates us from robots, AI, and so on, and why should we be wary of not being contaminated by the AI way of communicating, where there's no sense of humor, there's no irrationality, there are no tantrums, and there's no unexpected creativity. And I've also spoken about the soul, I think I would call it, of anthropology, which is the holistic, the comparative, and that which starts with relationship and process and people in place, rather than the deductive logic of universal solutions. But the third thing I wanted to say is that, well, I've already put it here on my presentation, that we should celebrate not just human and ecological diversity, which is really the topic of anthropology. You know, I once asked our respected colleague Ulf Hannes, so Ulf, I said, what if you were to sum up what is anthropology? What do we do? And he's been in the game, since I was born, actually, for a very long time. He started early. And Ulf Hannes says it's a study of human diversity, which is a very succinct way of putting it. And I think he's right. But we shouldn't just celebrate human diversity, and increasingly we now look at ecological and even biocultural diversity, and for good reasons, living in the Anthropocene of environmental crisis and nature loss and not least climate change. But we should also celebrate the diversity within our own discipline. Just think about it. I'm speaking from one periphery to another. English, well, I'm cheating a bit. English is nearly my first language, okay? I started with English very early. But we have vernaculars, smaller languages, non-hegemonic, less prestigious. They're not going to get as many quotations in Scopus or going to improve our H index, and yet they are important. So the total dominance of English, which is actually fairly recent, until the Second World War, any card-carrying anthropologist from the metropolitan areas had to master at least the three sort of major, as it were, academic languages: English, German, and French. No longer the case. The Germans, they have to struggle just like you and me to publish in English. So it's really very unfortunate. You know, when I studied philosophy 40 years ago, before becoming an anthropologist, we were told by our lecturers to avoid translations of Kant and Hegel, since certain thoughts allegedly could only be expressed in German. This may be the case up to a point, but if it is, there are also ideas and thoughts that are best expressed in Romanian or in Norwegian, and you could really add any language. So in IASA and in world anthropology, we have a job to do in this domain as well. And I'm not foreign, I'm pragmatic. I'm not foreign to the thought that AI can be helpful in making anthropological texts in foreign languages available and accessible to all of us. But real people must have the final say, lest the translation becomes superficial and contribute to exactly the kind of flattening that we anthropologists committed to diversity should be wary and suspicious of. And here we have a major task in the present and in the future. So I'm one of those strange people who thinks and is convinced that in this globalized world where everything seems to become more and more the same, as it were, and where communication across boundaries has become frictionless and easy and instantaneous, this is the time when anthropology should be allowed to shine. Not the time of Malinowski, not the time of Boas, but the time in which we live. This is when we need anthropologists more than ever, and when technology needs anthropologists more than ever. So, on that note, again, I thank you for the invitation, and I wish you the best of luck with the conference, and, thank you for listening. Warm collegial greetings, as it says there, from one European periphery to another. And I'm not going to try and read out the Google Translate version of the Norwegian, but I'll do the Norwegian ones. Tusen takk, og lykke til med konferansen. Bye now from Oslo.